you so much. Yeah, thank you very much, guys, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this piece, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Still remember the first time I heard it in its entirety. It has this real kind of transformative, sickening quality about it. So yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry.
We can.
Two. Okay, thank you. I should make this. Is there a way to make it full screen?
Control L.
Control L. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. So the piece I'm going to be speaking about today is Michael Finnissy's Verdi Transcriptions, which is work for solo piano composed between 1972 and 2005. It exists as a completed cycle of 4 books and also as a 1995 torso, which is this. It's marked by a use of quotation, whereby instead of, say, audiative imagination or processual logic or aleatorical operation, or indeed some of the spectral processes we've been looking at yesterday, the composer takes excerpt from the works of Verdi as a sort of found object, which is then transformed through various compositional processes. Finnissy himself places such a procedure in a tradition that ranges from Duchamp to Warhol, and in its exploration of the implications of a society whereby the weight of canonical memory enacts its own atemporal negation. It incorporates into its structural mechanics a number of extra musical ideas. In the consideration of these, I hope to show the possibilities of a redeployed Lacanianism, a redeployed Lacanian musicology, that is, by historicising the concerns of both Lacan and Finnissy through a Jamesonian Marxism, whereby Lacan's concepts denote the emergence of superstructural symptoms rather than essentialist categories of human experience. In terms of the proposed field, Lacan's almost complete silence upon music has not deterred a body of work emerging which Kenneth Smith champions as an effective new branch of contemporary music criticism. Now, amongst others, this particular quote serves to, inadvertently, to summarise the 2 primary problems with Smith's approach. On one hand, this field in general, actually, not just Smith. On one hand, the misapplication of the concepts, which this argument minimises, and on the other, the contextual impropriety of their use, which is repurposed as a strength. So the former, and that is that Lacan, the quote is, Lacan's ideas are employed on an unsystematic ad hoc basis to explicate certain compositional ideas, refers to the indiscriminate reification of the 3 Lacanian orders of the real, symbolic and imaginary into mere empirical descriptors. Lacan's vitally Heideggerian project of stressing the process over the object is undone, with the concepts instead becoming formal categories of aesthetic organisation through which a work's elements can be catalogued. Thus, when, say, David Schwartz in his work on the Beatles, or Smith himself on Zemlinsky, attempt to locate, for instance, the Lacanian real in an element such as the white noise at the end of She's So Heavy, or in Zemlinsky's quartal harmony, the Lacanian real becoming an element which merely functions within an artwork system of signification, though perhaps useful for that critique, becomes otherwise meaningless. Indeed, the Riley Smethurst in an article goes so far as to say, to contend that a serious Lacanian musicology will only be founded upon a complete rejection of this approach. He says, say no to Lacanian musicology. However, though completely divergent on the surface, the 2 are united in their attempt at a wish to fix a kind of encyclopedic stability to these concepts, and both Smethurst's prescriptive return to the texts themselves and Smith's naive systemization of their relevant components find contemporaneous parallels across the humanities, in literature, in politics. And I'd argue that such anxieties should be read more generally against what might banally be termed the end of postmodernism and the crises this implies for certain modes of thought. Indeed, if you look at something like Sokal and Brickmont's 1997 work, Fashionable Nonsense, which is often cited as a useful determiner in that shift in periodization, Lacan is the first figure to be interrogated and supposedly exposed as the flagship of the postmodern imposter. Now, leaving aside the weaknesses of this argument, the obvious irony of a pair of writers criticizing another by way of false dichotomy, argument by implication, etc., etc. The nomination of a Lacanian secular mysticism is what they call it, a secular mysticism, when decontextualized from its somewhat absurd origins, I think provides a new perspective in engaging with this body of theory, and that is to see Lacan as a structural effect, a secular structural effect. Lacan is the dynamic, creative origin of a body of theory, which in its recent, perhaps more Catholicized use becomes meaningless by way of standardization. For instance, in Zizek's simplified but useful pedagogy and in interdisciplinary fixing. What I mean is the concepts which are dependent upon a certain openness and become perhaps useless when used as empirical categories, and certainly impoverished when fixed to a certain application. And this brings us to the second of the two problems implicit in Smith's advocacy, and that's the dehistoricized relationship that Smith draws between Lacan's ideas and, via Wagner and Schoenberg, a transcendental kind of essentialist human relationship to music. Of course, this is a problem that stems from Lacan himself rather than any misapplication of the concepts. Adorno's criticism of Heidegger's failure to historicize his idea of human nature, Dasein, falls equally upon Lacan's psychoanalytical development of that phenomenological tradition. It may seem obvious that Lacan's idea of an essentialist idea of alienation, his notion of a divided subject, particularly, I think, the uncanny felicity of his thought to the art form of cinema, figures him as the critic of the late capitalist condition. And yet applied Lacanianism from Smith to Zizek commonly employs his work in the analysis of pre-modern works. And with reference to the previous point regarding assimilization and de-radicalization of concepts, I think it's vital to maintain that modes of thought, such as this, which insist upon the construction of perspective, continue to insist upon temporal context as a vital constituent of that which constructs. So therefore, if we read Lacanian theory via Lacan's own insistence on a materialism of the signifier, and through Jameson's dictum that we can think abstractly about the world only to the extent that the world has become abstract, we can resolve both of these issues. Firstly, by seeing psychoanalysis and Lacanian thought as contingent upon the development of the subject under capitalism, as Jameson argues in The Political Unconscious. And secondly, by figuring Lacan's body of work as existing at the intersection between the ideological logic and utopian promise that postmodern culture constituted. Again, following Jameson in his 1991 book, Postmodernism, we can define that culture through what he terms a Lacanian schizophrenia, to chart both the basis and the impact of Lacan's work across society at large. If, in that case, Lacan's secular mysticism can be seen as the ideological utopian theory of that particular moment, par excellence. It forms the backdrop against which and the tools with which to analyse Finnissy's music. Lacanian analysis as a central paradigm of Jameson's analysis of postmodernism can be compared with Finnissy's approach to show how the latter, struggling with the same socio-historic antagonisms, contains and transcends those within his artwork. So we'll start by examining how those concepts might apply to the Verdi Transcriptions, and flying in the face of everything I've just said, I will hesitate a brief summary of their relationship. So Lacan presents the human condition as that of an essentially alienated individual, which then creates a fictional alienating unity through an imaginary identification with its mirror image. And this is then divided by its inscription into the symbolic order of language. What Lacan terms the real is the pre-Oedipal immediacy of life, which we symptomatically experience only through moments of trauma, symbolic disintegration. So vital to the short investigation today is the relationship between this idea of a fictive imaginary unity and a symbolic determination which both frees us from this alienation while simultaneously fixing our subjectivity through the restrictions of its discourse. So to begin with the imaginary order, and just to emphasize again, this is defined by Lacan as by its constitutive alienation, in that disparity of experience is replaced by an externally given unity. And because of this, Dylan Evans argues that as an extrinsic fiction overlying complex actuality, the realm of the imaginary indicates and provokes the processes of reification and false consciousness. And this in turn leads the critic Bert Olivier in an excellent outline of the possibilities of a Lacanian musicology to show that because the imaginary constitutes the human tendency to hypostatize processes into objects through that alienating identification with various imaginary constructs, such as, for instance, political ideology. And we can critique specifically musical motifs which invite listener identification through this concept. And now, crucially, Olivier extends this idea to show how, in fact, it's the motifs themselves, rather than the associations, which may themselves function as the auditory loci of identification for listeners, which tempt one to adopt a position which is alienating insofar as it effectively precludes subsequent positions of identification with perhaps liberating sound images. Now, though the example that Olivier gives in his argument is that of Sibelius's Finlandia, with reference to its functions of nationalist ideology, I want to invoke Adorno to show how the same process is at work all around us in the culture industries, what Adorno refers to as the culture industry's exploitation and subsequent transformation of art music under late capitalism. In this quote from The Philosophy of New Music, Adorno explains how, through the uncritical listening habits fostered by the technological developments which determine music into background noise, musical style itself becomes reified and separated from its content. And reification in this sense means, rather than process into objects, means made commensurable, I think. He argues that Stravinsky, he's talking about Stravinsky here. Stravinsky's work revealed the irreconcilable breach between the subject and that in music which stands opposed to it as an objective element. There was a subject that in music is prohibited from speaking of itself, ceases actually to produce, and contents itself with the empty echo of an objective musical language which is no longer its own. Through the rigorous manipulation of this hollowed-out musical language reduced to wreckage, a second phantasmagorical and regressive musical language is brought into existence. Now, by situating the effects of the Lacanian imaginary within the context of Adorno's critique of his culture, we can appreciate how certain distinguishing features of a composer's characteristic sound world come to act as a unifying sound image which alienates the rich complexity of their practice, with historically determined styles supplanting the very interventions within those styles which made the composition meaningful in the first place. Now, I argue it's precisely the persistence of this socio-historic imaginary unity which Finnissy exploits in his transcriptions through the extra-symbolic effects of the choice of compositional source material, and that is their absent persistence as imaginary wholes. Combining these ideas, we can argue that through the audiation of canonical memory, ensured by the subsumption of the source material into the culture industry and the resultant alienating unities produced by this, the traces of the Verdi material work to engender a ghostly presence which kind of haunts the music in an absent conceptual obligato. This mishearing and misremembrance works with the various emergences of untransformed quotation to create what's an uncanny instability to which one can never be entirely sure what's being heard. And that this serves in turn to deconstruct and problematize the very unity which maintains this illusion. And in doing so, the listener's ultimately interpolated habits of alienating audiation are surpassed for an experience of the music on its own terms. For instance, take by way of example the opening of the piece, where the material is at its arguably at its most abstract and transformed. Despite the brutality of the register, the density of the clusters, and the complexity of the rhythmic transformations, the tertial harmony and dotted rhythms, when heard within the work's programmatic conceit as a horizon of expectation, are enough to create the auditive illusion of hearing something beyond what is being played, even indeed especially where it does not exist. The Lacanian idea of the lack as being constitutive of identity is here affirmed in that, as with the paradoxical alienation of the mirror stage, it's the individual's lack of unity which determines that very unity. And it's this, in my hearing at least, which determines the primary drama of the piece, with the physical immediacy of the music existing in counterpoint with this imaginary unity of the works that it's derived from. The problematization of audiation by both projecting and interrogating an extra musical imaginary unity extends throughout the work at various other levels. We don't really have time to go in for them, but to summarize through a kind of depth perspective by in an Ivesian counterpoint between references to the original music with a commentary on top that puts the music in and out of focus. Also by the at a technical level, problematizing our ability to audiate separate lines by combining them and by splitting them up across octaves, as here, or with this kind of pointillist effect. All of these reinforce the original idea because our learned alienating tendencies to perhaps organize these lines into separate unities are challenged by the deconstructive power of the processes themselves, and this again forces us into more direct and immediate confrontation with the music itself. On the other hand, Lacan's concept of the symbolic order illuminates the anxieties against which Finnissy is working regarding influence notation and originality. And indeed, for Finnissy, transcription and composition don't form neat categories of difference, but in his contemporary historical moment become radically commingled. In the words of Finnissy, transcription is not simply writing down, but creating webs of illusions, playing with subtexts, cultural codes. I often, even in pieces I don't acknowledge as transcriptions, I take the material from somewhere else, because how can you have an original idea in something as socially determined as music? Composition from transcription of a canonical source remains the same business of discovering what the object is and revealing what your perceptions are, what your insights are about the object. Now, alongside this, which forms as an exemplification of the Lacanian transition from the imaginary to the symbolic, historically, I think we can read these comments as articulating the final position of a move from the Kantian transcendental subject and its unification of experience to the Heideggerian subject that perceives a limited part of an external world, finally to the Lacanian turn on that, whereby that external world itself is a pre-given symbolic expanse of what Lacan refers to as the big other. That is the system of signification which speaks through us. And what's interesting about Finnissy's compositional approach is how originality is seen to emerge specifically through an intersection between the subject and the trans-subjectivity of the compositional process, in that it's the product of a historically determined tradition of symbolic discourse. For instance, though the big other of the symbolic is a radical anteriority which mediates our intersubjective relationships, as Dylan Evans argues, the possibility of their mediation and construction points the way through and out of that confining interiority. And thus it is that Olivier holds that then, for composers and musicologists, the only way to avoid entrapment within the illusory web of the imaginary is, in fact, to reject any the possibility of any homegrown originality at all. For Finnissy, this means that while we cannot auditively imagine a musical idea without it being in some way interpolated through the social determination of the big other of the symbolic order, we're able to go beyond the confines of our determined subjectivity by enlisting the symbolic. That is, for composers, the processes which extend beyond the limits of our socially determined imaginative and imaginary abilities. And in order to fully appreciate the significance of this, I'm going to touch on something that Roger was talking about at the beginning of the conference, which is the work of Bisogni, in comparing specifically Finnissy's approach to that of his forebear. In this work, A Sketch of New Music, Bisogni presented the unity of the musical idea as what I would read as the real of the late Romantic aesthetic, in that the composer's auditive imagination seemed to be the romantic locus of a pre-symbolic insight, which is then necessarily qualified through its inscription into the symbolic order. Notation, on the other hand, is presented as the transformative filtration of that individual unity into a determined textuality. Now, Bisogni argues that such a unity can only be restored through the insight of the performer into the extra notational concerns which the work must still contain. And this foregrounds a theory whereby creative living processes become paradoxically dependent upon their objectification into notational documents, with the romantic individual forming the cipher between truth as the inspiration and knowledge as its inscription. So Finnissy intervenes in Bisogni's procedure to replace auditive imagination with canonical memory as a means of acquiring the same insight into the extra-symbolic. Bisogni's anxieties regarding the restrictive conditionality of transcription here become the location of a post-structural attempt at originality through an inversion of the original formula. We can see this at work in Finnissy's use of a notation which contains the negation of its own constrictive tendencies. That is, Finnissy's notational language, which, though inherited rather than devised and determined by systemic means, realised through a system of traditional, determined and transsubjective language, still, in its demands upon the performer, affects a process which reaches beyond symbolisation. As Roger Redgate argues, Finnissy deliberately uses this technique to blur precision through, for instance, long complex irrationals intercut with long lines of grace notes, complex rhythms which reach across the full length of the keyboard. Such a notation produces the chaotic effects with which its own constrictive dictates are transcended. Crucially, this is accomplished through these constrictions rather than in their evasion in an experimentalism. And I think it's important to notice the historical transition here between the two, between Finnissy and Bisogni, and that's from the location of emancipatory power moves from the individual composer as a romantic artist to the canonical material as a found object, and similarly from the individual performer to the score text itself. In fact, I'd hesitantly argue that if anything could be said to define a new complexity, it might be this particular concern with leveraging notation against itself to open up individual insight within a world of nigh total determination. Of course, in factors of definition, differences become all the more crucial, and Finnissy's approach to this distinguishes him from his contemporary and peer, Ferneyhough, in the use of a notational complexity as a formal signifier rather than general aesthetic of the work. Again, I had to turn to an interview with Roger Redgate. Redgate explains how, from a performer's point of view, they couldn't be more different. With Ferneyhough's music, working through the notation, grasping the complexity of it is a vital part of forming an interpretation. Finnissy's music doesn't have the layers of complexity that Ferneyhough's has. The notation isn't about the complexity, but rather, crucially, for changing perspective of the musical image for the performer and the listener. And it's the shifts in these shifts in the focus of the performer's approach to the material and the resultant effect upon the listener are used to shape the form of the piece. For instance, parallel to the work's revelation of its source material in a distinct but uneven programmatic trajectory, runs Finnissy's problematization and accentuation of this through a chaotic indeterminacy affected by the introduction of the complex notation, which, as we've seen, works to reveal and emphasize that which exists beyond symbolization. Indeed, in the 1995 publication, it is the intensification of this parameter which forms the climax of the work before being limited and contained by the relatively more semiotically stable and apprehendable signifier of this downward gesture. Now, there's a lot more to say on the implications of this, and I think particularly on Finnissy's approach to temporality, but it's out with the scope of this investigation. Rather, I hope to have shown the possibilities of a Lacanian musicology which serves to illuminate and enrich aspects of Finnissy's piece, rather than enlisting the work in a demonstration of Lacan's ideas or reducing those ideas to an index of the work's elements. In this, I think it's important to retain the openness of Lacan's concepts by giving them their own posthumous motion through a predominantly Marxist rereading of his work. Now, though this comes at the price of their stable identities, I hold that more is lost in fixing them to their origins. And of course, the primarily Jamesonian strategy employed here shouldn't be taken to be as prescriptive. Similarly, it would be foolish to think that such a reading of the Verdi Transcriptions could ever be exhaustive. This music is both wise and ludic. It reaches past the possibilities of academic discourse, psychoanalytical, Marxist, or otherwise. And though such ideas can help to show the implications of some of them, ultimately the music's insights will always be its own. Or, as Finnissy argues in the quote that forms the title of this paper, art is measured by something other than musicological judgments. This could, of course, following the approaches of Smith and Smethurst that we rejected at the outset of this discussion, be contorted as a reference to the claims of the Lacanian real. But perhaps listening to the piece itself, we find it to be something far more mysterious, far more significant, perhaps far more, for want of a better word, real. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Any comments, observations, questions? I actually find it particularly fascinating how Finnissy uses the transcription. He actually transcribes. Not only transcribes Verdi to a piano, but he transcribes Verdi to another kind of culture, another kind of consciousness. And I find that very intriguing in a way. So maybe that would be a material for discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about his work, and the kind of the counterpoint between time periods, and also the ideas involved in both and how they shimmer in and out of focus. It's very beautiful.
If there are no more questions, then thank you very much.